The Midnight Visitor. This deleted episode of Peppa Pig was never aired on TV. It all started when Peppa and George heard strange footsteps coming from the hallway during the night. The footsteps were slow and heavy, like someone was wandering around the house, but the house was quiet and dark. Peppa and George got out of bed and quietly walked towards the door. In the hallway, they saw a shadowy figure in the shape of a pig, but its outline was blurred, and the shape seemed too large for a normal person. Peppa and George froze in fear. "George, who is that? Is that Daddy Pig?" Peppa whispered, her voice trembling. They rushed to wake their parents, but Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were sound asleep, not reacting to their calls. The children turned back to the door, but the shadow had disappeared, leaving behind only the smell of fresh earth in the air. "What is that smell? It's like fresh dirt," Peppa said, her voice full of confusion and fear. Unable to understand what was happening, Peppa and George decided to follow the shadow. They went out into the garden and discovered a freshly dug grave with a headstone that read, "Here lies Peppa Pig." The earth around the grave was still warm, as if it had been recently dug. "Peppa, what's going on? Why does it say your name?" George whispered, his voice filled with panic. Panicking, they ran to their neighbors, hoping to find someone alive. But as they reached the village, they realized it was empty. All the houses were locked, and the streets were deserted. It seemed like everyone had disappeared. Where is everyone? "Why is the village empty?" Peppa asked, her heart racing. When they returned home, they saw a figure rising from the ground beneath their house. It was a figure in a shroud, resembling them, but with hollow eyes and an eerie smile. The figure slowly moved toward them and waved, as if inviting them to join. "Peppa, is that us?" George cried, horrified. The figure took another step closer, and Peppa and George stood frozen, unable to move. They realized that this figure was not just a mirror image. It was them, but twisted and dark, and it was coming for them. They understood they had been trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. "We can't escape. This isn't us. It's some kind of nightmare," Peppa shouted in panic. As they tried to flee, everything around them faded into darkness. Their home, their familiar world, vanished, leaving only shadows that pulled them into this twisted, eerie reality. The ominous song. This episode was never aired on TV. It all started when Peppa and George found an old music box in a chest in the attic. George accidentally wound it up, and a strange, unnatural melody began to play. The music was eerie, almost as if it shouldn't be heard at that moment. The music grew louder, and the air in the room turned cold and heavy. Suddenly, the walls began to ripple as though they were breathing. Shadows on the walls began to come alive, stretching into odd, twisted shapes that moved around the room. Peppa and George noticed their reflections in the mirror had become distorted. Their eyes were enormous, and their smiles twisted into something unnatural, like they weren't their own. "I can't take this anymore," whispered Peppa, grabbing George's hand. But when they tried to leave, the door was locked. The music grew louder, and the room began to fill with darkness. At that moment, Papa Pig rushed into the room, his face twisted in a strange smile. He saw the music box and said with surprise, "This is my old music box. I thought I lost it years ago." But his voice was different, deep and unnatural. "Papa, what's happening to you?" asked Peppa in fear. As soon as Papa Pig touched the box, his body began to distort. His face twisted, his eyes darkened, and his arms elongated unnaturally. "Now I can play again," he whispered, and his laugh, low and metallic, filled the room. Peppa and George watched in horror as Papa Pig lost all human form, his body collapsing into a shadow that couldn't stop moving. "I can't stop it," he said, and his figure faded into the darkness, swallowed by emptiness. The box started playing again. The music became unbearably loud, echoing through the room as if the room itself was alive. The walls cracked, and the shadows grew more menacing. Suddenly, Peppa and George felt something pulling them inside. They couldn't move, couldn't resist. "What's happening?" screamed George, but his voice was drowned by the music. At that moment, everything around them turned dark, and the room disappeared. Instead, they found themselves in an endless void, an abyss, where there was nothing but the sound of the music. Inside the box, everything was closed off, consuming them into its vast depths. Peppa and George stood in this nightmarish void, surrounded by dark shadows that wouldn't let them go. Their bodies grew heavier, and the music became more unbearable, as if it were a part of this endless darkness. "Are we stuck here forever?" whispered Peppa. And just as they tried to speak their last words, everything around them dissolved into the darkness, and the sound of the box merged with the silence.